Well, hello, everybody. I think you might have caught Julie and me chatting a little bit beforehand, but I'd like to kind of get a show of hands of people, if you can hear me. Hello. How's everybody doing out there? Go ahead and if you can get on your dashboard and give me a show of hands, make sure I've got sound from everybody can hear our broadcast. Excellent. Thank you, Tammy. All right. Well, hey, welcome everybody. I'm Lance Miner with NextLearn, and you have joined in the Immersive Learning University's monthly webinar series. This month we have Julie Dirksen, and she's a good friend of the NextLearn family. In fact, she was one of our keynote speakers last year at the ILU conference that we had in San Antonio, and she's joining us this month. So welcome, Julie. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
All right. Yeah, we're going to be the ILU conference is going again. We're going to be having it in Charleston this year, so it'll be the January 27th through the 30th, and we've got some workshops that are going to be going the first couple days, and then our keynote speaker, Clark Quinn, who's doing a webinar series with us in the build-up to that, he'll be our keynote speaker there in Charleston. So if you get a chance and can, as the course of the conference circuit gets really busy, if you can make it down to Charleston to join us, it would be great. So I invite everybody to check out the Immersive Learning University website. We've got registration open, so please come on down and register. We'd like to have everyone. So, but let's turn our focus to Julie. And again, Julie, I really appreciate you, doing the webinar with us this month. It's, I'm a kind of a amateur writer myself, and the idea of storytelling and bringing that into the instructional design department is something that's near and dear to my heart. So, for those of you who don't know Julie, she's an independent consultant. She's an instructional designer. You've done work for Fortune 500 companies and other startups as well. Isn't that right, Julie?
Oh yeah, absolutely. All sorts of different kinds of consulting for different businesses in general learning and a lot in e-learning.
Yeah, I sat through your session there in San Antonio. But Julie brings a lot of wealth to us today, a wealth of knowledge today, and she's specifically going to be talking about storytelling and how it can be used as a powerful learning to make your learning tools that much more powerful. So Julie, I'm not going to banter on anymore, and if you want to go ahead and I'm going to give control of the screen to you, and if you'd like to do your thing,
sure.
Let's get started.
All right, yeah, thanks for joining everybody today. We don't have a proper chat panel, but we do have the question area. So if you have questions or comments or things like that, feel free to throw it into the question panel, because I always like to kind of hear what people's reactions are. I'm going to share my presentation, and hopefully that's showing up.
Yep, we got you now, Julie. Looks good.
Great. And so anyway, a little bit of background on this one. As Lance mentioned, I did this. I was a keynote speaker at the ILU last year, which was actually a really nice little event. I thought you guys did a great job with it. And it was really nice because it was. I think everybody who attends understands the importance of immersive learning environments and of scenario-based learning and some of those kinds of things. So it was actually a great group to talk to, because you didn't have to kind of sell them on that first and then get into how to do it. You could kind of skip straight to steps 2 and 3 and 4. And one of the sessions that was pretty well received there was, okay, if we are doing things like scenario-based learning, if we are doing things like using stories, using cases, all of those kinds of things, one of the questions that I had is, how do you do a good job at that, basically? And so I had spent some time. I will go ahead. You already did the introduction, so we're great. I don't think I have much to add. I'm a big learning nerd. You can find me at usablelearning.com, and I also have a book called Design for How People Learn. So that's the remaining details about who I am. But there's a couple of things about this. One is it's really about the learning. And the stuff that we're going to talk about today, we'll spend a little bit of time on kind of why storytelling and why narrative techniques are important for learning. But then actually the bulk of the session is just going to be how to be a good storyteller, essentially. kind of narrowed down to what I see as being some of the most valuable pieces and some very specific techniques for doing that in learning environments. The important thing, and I'll just claim that right now as well, is that the important thing is to not let the story take over. The point isn't isn't fundamentally to tell a good story. When you're writing fiction, it is, but when you're excuse me, when you're doing this, the point is to kind of reinforce the learning. And what I'm talking about here today, a lot of the techniques I'm talking about are really just tools in your toolbox. We learn a lot in instructional design about kind of the outside pieces of it, like how to do good analysis, how to build stuff, how to implement, how to evaluate, all of those kinds of pieces. And I've found, generally speaking, that I don't think we get enough kind of guidance about, and when you're actually in design, how do you make good learning experiences? How do you make them fun? How do you make them engaging? How do you make them sticky? All of those kinds of ideas. And so this is just one more sort of element that I found that I think is useful. And the other thing about it is, don't think you have to do all of these things, or if this is even the right answer in all of your learning scenarios. The answer is it's probably not. But if you are trying to use a story as a way to frame a kind of complicated topic or something like that, there are ways to make your story better that you're using to drive these things. So that's kind of the disclaimer on that. There's one big shout out. A lot of this stuff came from a podcast that I was listening to quite a bit. When I was writing my own book, even though it was a nonfiction book, I was listening to this podcast that was all about fiction writing, and it also got into things like book publishing and stuff like that, which was really handy. But it's called storywonk.com. I think it's a lot of fun, and I've gotten a lot of really useful stuff out of it. Some of the people involved in that one have also done one called Popcorn Dialogues, which is really fun, where they take movies and then they break it down by what's the character arc, who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist, how is plot development, where are the act breaks, and all of these kinds of sort of technical questions of fiction writing that can potentially be useful. When you take some of these things and you apply them mechanistically to fiction writing, it can get a little bit mechanical. But the kind of writing we're doing, we're not trying to write great fiction. We're trying to write interesting stories. And so, again, these are tools for trying to do that. So I want to spend a little bit of time on why we care about stories and why we think they're useful as learning tools. And I've got kind of 3 or 4 reasons that I think they really are important. One is context, another is triggers, another is emotional context, and the last one's kind of the idea of managing cognitive load. And so I'll talk about this a little bit. One of the things that happens in a lot of learning environments is we get a bit of a disconnect between the context for learning and the context for use. So I'm learning about this really complicated thing in a classroom that's quiet and calm and kind of bland and a little bit boring and all these things, and I take that and I move it into the environment where I'm actually using the information, which is noisy and difficult and challenging and all of these kinds of things, and you get a bit of a disconnect between those two things. And the environment and the context that you learn something in has a really big impact on how well you retain that information. So, for example, if you're going to study if you're going to choose a place to study for a test, you could pick your favorite coffee shop, or you could pick a quiet library, or you could pick the classroom that has, it's kind of gray and it's windowless and it has a noisy HVAC system. Well, the last one might not be pleasant, but actually from a knowledge and retention point of view, the last one's actually going to be your best bet, because the environment that you learn something in becomes part of the environment that, becomes part of your ability to pull that information or pull that memory back out of storage, basically long-term memory. And so if we learn something as a kind of completely decontextualized fact, completely outside of the environment where we're going to apply it, it becomes a lot more challenging to remember that when you're on the job and you're doing things. And so one of the reasons I like stories is because it helps us provide a little bit more of that context. Maybe not the physical context, but it gives you some of the situations and scenarios and reasons you're going to use that information. And this is my issue with themes a little bit, because I was having a conversation with a client where they were like, well, we kind of want to use a Wild West theme in the course. I'm like, okay, but, you know, we might want to actually use their actual workplace as the setting rather than the Wild West, because, you know, they're not going to, having rattlesnakes and, you know, saloons become part of that memory. It might make it more engaging, might not, but it won't help them retrieve it later, because they're not going to be trying to use this in a saloon or in a, you know, dusty shootout or near trees and boulders and rattlesnakes and things like that. So I'm not a big theme person. I like the idea of kind of putting it in a realistic context or a realistic story, more as an engagement device than something that's kind of a disconnected theme. So the other big piece of this is contextual triggers. So for example, you're training call center reps on a process for dealing with angry customers. And so if we think about this, if we think about what are the triggers that tell the learner that they need to activate that knowledge. You've taught them this nice process, maybe it's a 3-step process for calming down angry people. And if we start to think about what are the triggers for telling me that, oh, I need to go over to this 3-step process and use it, you know, it's the tone of voice of the customer, it's the words that they're using, it's the statements that they're saying. And what you want to do is start to create an association between, here's this trigger, here's this thing happening in the environment, and here's the response I need to make. Because we've probably all seen the situation where, you know, you learn a perfectly good thing in a class somewhere away there, and then when you get back into the workplace, you know, it was a great idea, but boy, you're just kind of caught back up in the, you know, the fact that this person's angry with you, or the fact that there's all this stuff going on, and it, you know, the good process you learn just kind of doesn't connect back in with the real world environment. And so one of the other reasons I like storytelling as a strategy is what we want is we want kind of almost an automatic, you know, it's kind of like the classical conditioning where the, you know, the dogs would see the, you know, hear the bell in their mouths with water kind of stuff. And I don't want to kind of make it sound like animal training, because that sounds bad, but you do want this kind of like, oh, boom, here's the trigger, here's my response. So being able to recognize, here's the thing that tells you you need to use this, and here's the associated response or memory that you need to bring in, that can be really, you know, an important part of helping people adopt new behaviors or adopt new practices. So for example, hello, there we go. You know, this is from a terrorism training course. This is on interactions, which a quick thank you to them for letting me use the demo. They talk about RAIN as a method for dealing with, WMD attacks. So if there's a terrorist attack or something, you're supposed to recognize the threat, you're supposed to avoid the hazard and contamination, you're supposed to isolate the hazard area, you're supposed to notify the appropriate personnel. So great, these are all really good things to do. The problem is that you get into one of these really high-stress, difficult situations, and all that great stuff that you learned in your nice classroom just kind of goes right out of your head. And so that's why we want to have things like scenarios, things with some story or some sense of narrative to it, so that you, when you get into a stressful situation, you've already kind of practiced that response a little bit. And so you're not overwhelmed by the stress or difficulty of the situation. You've already kind of lived through practicing it and trying it out, so it makes it more likely that you're actually going to be able to kind of sum it up and transfer that behavior. And so, you know, when we put people into the environment, and by storytelling, I'm talking about fiction writing, so we're thinking of text stories, but you can tell stories with images, you can tell stories with online scenarios, you can tell stories with role plays. There's a lot of ways to do that. And those kinds of things help start kind of creating that association between the trigger and the environment and the behavior that you want people to do. So for example, if I want to start creating a real association between, hey, you know, don't leave your phone plugged in after it's fully charged, because it draws a degree of, it continues to draw some electricity, and so it's basically wasteful, and you want to conserve energy and have cheaper electric bills, and also not have it's not very green to kind of waste electricity for no good purpose. And so you want to create an association between the trigger and the action, between seeing something plugged in and unplugging the phone, and kind of making that almost an automatic gesture. And we talked about this in the terrorism example. If the context for learning is really calm and the context for application is really stressful, that actually creates a blocking effect in itself. High stress is going to impair your ability to pull kind of cognitive information out of memory. But if you've had a chance to kind of practice and get used to it, you're more likely to be able to pull the information back out. And that little bit of stress, especially if you're feeling a little bit of the stress when you learned it, then that little bit of stress is less likely to interfere with the retrieval of that information later on. So, and facts need context too, because we're fundamentally sort of emotional decision makers. The idea that of rational decision making is essentially a myth. There's a researcher named Antonio Damasio, who's a neuroscience researcher. I want to say he's in Columbia, maybe. But he's done a lot of work with people who have a certain amount of brain damage in emotional areas. And so, for example, these are people who've either had injuries of some kind, maybe a car accident, or strokes that have knocked out a particular brain region that really governs their ability to feel strongly. And these people with normal intelligence, they'll do fine on an intelligence test, but they report kind of having a fairly low emotion life. They don't get very angry, they don't get very sad, they don't get very happy. They kind of have a very sort of flat emotional affect. Well, the myth of rational decision making would say that without all those messy emotions, these people would be great decision makers. And actually, the opposite is pretty much true. These people are such poor decision makers that it practically amounts to a disability sometimes. And what it really comes down to is that even if we're analyzing all of the rational aspects of a situation, we fundamentally rely at a certain point on that emotional tug in one direction or another to help you make a decision. So even if you're I mean, I know that I have kind of emotional tugs of ooh, this car feels nice if I'm car shopping, or oh, this whole car dealership is nice and they're nice to me and they don't insult me by saying, kind of dumb car salesman things. And so now I feel good towards it, and I'm going to look for reasons to justify buying this car. The emotional aspect of decision making is very much there. And even if you're a person who reads all the consumer reports and does all the research and has the criteria and has it and tries to be as objective as possible, there's still an emotional component of confirming yourself as a rational decision maker. So whenever we're making decisions in the world, the emotional context of that matters. So for example, if the sales commission is going to be 10%, seems like it's the most objective kind of fact. It's a specific percentage, it's a clear fact. But in terms of, somebody in a sales training knowing what to do with that, having some kind of context around it, having some kind of story around it, it makes a difference. So this tells me that the sales commission is going to be 10%. It's kind of an awesome thing. This tells me the sales commission is going to be 10% is an enraging thing. And this tells me that the sales commission is going to be 10% is a very, very bad news. So having a sense of emotional context around facts, it may sound a little touchy-feely, but really it helps a lot with knowing how do I have to feel about this, or what do I need to do with this information. And one of the things that happens a lot in training programs is information kind of gets stripped down to the sales commission is going to be 10%, or here are the steps for responding to a WMD attack, or here is the process for dealing with an angry customer. Without kind of wrapping it in some of that context, it becomes much harder to know when and how and what I should do with that information and how I should apply it and how I should use it to help me make decisions. So it's nice to have it decontextualized for efficiency's sake, but then what we want to do is take it and put it back into a context that helps me understand what does this mean for me, how do I make decisions with it, what's the impact of it going forward, and that's one of the big things that storytelling can kind of do for us. Another thing that storytelling is nice about is it's helpful for managing cognitive load. We can overload users pretty quickly in terms of the amount of information that we give them, and when they're learning a new process and they're learning something that they don't already know. And part of the reason that cognitive load gets kind of overloaded really quickly is when you don't already have a framework for something, you don't have kind of places to put the information. So if you think of your brain as being like a closet, when you're really an expert, you have this sort of California closet, and somebody hands you a new piece of information. So you're an expert insurance person, and somebody tells you about a subrogation, a new legislation about subrogation in a particular state. You know exactly where to put that information. You're like, okay, I can put it over here, and I can do this with it, and I know exactly kind of how to understand and process that information. And I've got a shelf, I've got a space to put it on in my mental model or in my construct for this. If you're a novice to something, you don't have any place to put that information, and so you make a big pile in the bottom of the closet, which is what my closet looks like right now, which is a big pile of stuff on the floor, and you just kind of have to throw stuff on. And then if you have to try to find it again, it's kind of hard. You have to sort of basically dig through and hope you run into it. So one of the other things that storytelling does for us in a learning environment is it gives us a framework to understand something. So if I'm asking you to just kind of understand insurance procedures, that's a lot of cognitive load, and I don't have any place to put that information. But if I'm reading a story about Ryan and his family, and Ryan's been in an accident, and he's going through the whole insurance claim process, and we've got everything that's happening to sort of Ryan's family throughout the process, that gives me some place to put the information, because it ties it to emotional elements, and also we already have a framework and a shelf for stories, especially if you're working within the same culture. So if you're working within a sort of standard North American culture, we have cultural rules for how stories work. I'm going to introduce the characters. I'm going to learn about what the conflict is. Some things are going to happen that are going to escalate. Eventually there's going to be a conflict, and then there's going to be a resolution, which will tell me what the kind of the point of the story is. Whether we know it or not, we know what those rules are. So when I'm handing you information in a story, we're not throwing the clothes in the big pile in the bottom of the closet. You're putting it on the shelves that you have for how a story works. And so one of the nice things that does is, if we think about cognitive load and the idea that you can overload people's working memory and stuff like that, by using a storytelling framework, you can help extend the amount of information that they can process, because they do have places to put it that flow along a narrative time frame in the story and that kind of fit into those story elements. And again, I missed the chat window, but we're in the webinar version. But if you have any kind of comments or questions, feel free to throw them up in the question window. So those are the reasons that I think that storytelling is really interesting. So if we think about it, one of the things to kind of look at is, what are some scenarios that we can apply this to. And I'm just going to throw these out here right now, and we'll come back to them actually a little bit later in the presentation. So how could we make a story out of teaching somebody interviewing skills? How could we make a story out of teaching somebody sales skills? How could we make a story out of computer skills, computer training, that kind of thing? So throwing those out there, we're going to come back to those a little bit later on. But one we'll take a look at right away. So, but we're going to look at how can we use stories to make those vivid and compelling. So let's start with one. Let's say you're doing restaurant safety. You need to do basic food safety, employee safety, workplace safety course for restaurants. And people have been through this all before, but they need to go through it again for compliance purposes, all that kind of stuff. And so we want to figure out how to make an interesting story that kind of carries us through all of the learning that we need to do about restaurant safety. Now remember, and I remember at the beginning I mentioned the fact that, the story is really secondary, and one of the things you need to watch out for is that writing stories is fun, and it's really easy to get kind of caught up in that, but it needs to not take over from the main point, which in this case would be to learn the kind of safety elements. But if we think about it, we would want to use certain story elements, and this is again the stuff that I thought was really useful in this podcast for fiction writers. I was like, oh, instructional designers could use this information. This could be, this could be some useful strategies and techniques. So when we're when fiction writers are starting a story, they will frequently start with the area of start with the area of the protagonist. Who's the hero? You know, who's the main person in this environment, and what do they care about, basically? What's their goal? You know, what do they should want something, and then what's their problem? Like, what's standing in between them and the goal? What's the trouble? What's the thing that's kind of blocking them from being able to reach their goal?
Hey, Julie.
Yep.
Julie. Hey, I got this kind of a prompted a thought for me. You know, a lot of times designers, they may not be totally enmeshed in the industry that they're writing about. Maybe they've been brought in as a contractor to help another organization like you and I have done to help them develop content. I mean, this is a really good point where if you're working with SMEs to try to get them to help translate what they do into something more palatable. I mean, in terms of, it makes me think, like, if they can, sometimes the SME themselves can provide context or content for that protagonist in the story to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and this gives them a framework. If they can think about stories, I've had that conversation with a lot of SMEs where they're telling me stuff, and I'm like, okay, so how did you learn that? How do you, where did you learn it? And they'll be like, oh, well, there was this one time with the Jeep and the rain got in it and it messed up the transmission, and that's the whole thing. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a great story. That's a fabulous thing, and it's obviously how you remember it, so why don't we use some of those kinds of stories for other purposes. I was just working with a group that was doing project management training for construction, and they were having a hard time getting people, they had a lot of process, but they were having a hard time getting people to really see the big picture and how little decisions you make up front kind of impact the end of it. And I was like, well, you might want to use a story and a narrative through it, because then you can kind of talk about all the pain points that occur for somebody when they're project managing one of these kinds of things, and show the consequences of some little decisions make up front and how they turn out towards the end.
Yeah, a lot of time the experts themselves, they don't know why they know things, and it's hard for them to translate what their level of knowledge to other people. But if you bring them down to a story, put it into a context of their experience, and I put quotes around the term experience, then all of a sudden they realize what we as designers are asking for. So, well,
yep.
All right, well, yeah, please, people. Hey, the questions are open, so please, the question line's open, so please send them this way, and hopefully Julie will get to it. Thanks.
Yeah, so if we have a protagonist, we've got a hero, we give them a goal, we give them a problem. So if we've got our hero, we're kind of focusing on the food safety, but we've got our kind of situation. We've got Eric, he's an ambitious young chef. He just got hired at La Primavera, a fine dining restaurant that's been a fixture for years, but lately gotten a bit tired and predictable. The owner hired Eric to sort of freshen up Primavera's image. If he proves himself here, he's going to be one step closer to opening his own restaurant. So if we add the goal, if we have a protagonist, if we add a goal, what do they want? And it's really, what do they really, really, really want? We find out that Eric wants to put La Primavera on the culinary map, and he wants to shake things up because there's a food review coming up. He really wants to be on the best of list. That's his big goal. He wants to make that happen. And we want him to make that happen because, then he's going to be able to move him closer to his dream of owning his own restaurant and all of these kinds of things. So then what we can do is we can actually, if we start with a protagonist, we can add an antagonist. Somebody to create some tension in your story so that feels like there's some stakes. It feels like there's some immediacy to it. So we've got an antagonist. Eric's in charge of the kitchen, but the front of house manager is the owner's sister, Joanne. She was very good friends with the previous chef manager and argued bitterly with the owner over the decision to replace the previous chef. So she's not happy about it. So, the thing about it, and too, is that the antagonist should have an opposing goal. So Eric wants one thing. He wants to kind of come in and innovate and get on this best of list. And now Joanne's goal is, Joanne strongly believes that the soul of La Primavera lies in its sense of tradition, and she'll passionately defend those traditions. Quite frankly, she's just not convinced that Eric has enough experience to run things, and that his desire to innovate is just going to cause problems. And the thing about antagonists is they're not necessarily bad people, or they're not necessarily evil. They just want something different than what the protagonist wants. So now we've got a conflict, and so that kind of mediating that conflict throughout these sort of scenarios can help us kind of craft a structure or framework that, you want people kind of coming back and saying, well, what's going to happen? And so that's one of the things that kind of keeps the experience sticky for people. So Eric's going to do this. He's going to make this menu sing. It's going to be a whole new world. The owner's a little wary because I don't have the experience being in charge of a kitchen. But how hard can it be? I've been working in kitchens for years, and I know my way around. I know my way around. And when he tastes my new menu, he's going to forget all his other worries. So the deal is, you also want your hero to have kind of a weakness or a flaw, something that's not great, because that's going to give you an arc to help develop this person and to move them forward. And so Eric's weakness is he's really good at the cooking side, but maybe he's not as good at some of the other kitchen management stuff as he should be. And now he's in charge of that stuff, and he's going to have to step up his game, but his attention is kind of geared towards, the food and things like that, and not towards sort of the kitchen maintenance piece. And quite frankly, he's a little bit kind of cocky about it, and he's not necessarily going to pay as much attention to some of the things like kitchen safety and food safety and all of those sorts of things, or is quite as concerned with it as he is with making the menu really fabulous. So if we try this now for interviewing and sales, I don't know if you guys can use the question thing, but if we were going to try to do this, and let's give it a shot. Let's see if we can totally hack that question box. If we were going to do this for something like interviewing or sales or computer skills, can you think of, how could we do a protagonist goal, antagonist, opposing goal, weakness, and you don't necessarily have to answer all 5, but if you want to throw an idea out there, that would be great. I'm going to give you guys a minute to type, and we'll see if anybody responds to this one.
A protagonist for interviewing. We've got a young teenager looking for a job out of high school. How about that?
Okay, so if we're teaching interviewing skills, like how to be a good interviewer, or if we're teaching how to interview for a job, like interviewing skills so the teenager right out of school, if we're teaching how to be a good how to get a job and be good at doing an interview and getting a job would be a great protagonist. Sure.
We got another one, Rebecca. She says, for sales, a salesperson, the go-getter who wants to increase sales.
Right. So for interviewing, maybe you've got an HR person who's trying to help the managers be better interviewers, and perhaps they're not hiring the people that they want to hire. Perhaps they're not staying strictly within the legal guidelines of interviewing. And so your HR person is trying to convince a couple of challenging managers that they need to change the way that they're doing interviews, because the hiring for a few key positions is coming up, and it's really important to get the right people into those positions. And also, she wants to really strongly avoid lawsuits coming into the company. So maybe got a couple of different antagonists in that situation.
Or the HR person. You got an HR person who is tired of dealing with, if they would hire people, be more selective with who they hire, they wouldn't be dealing with all the HR issues later on. So they trying to put some do some problem solving with some good foresight.
Yep, absolutely. So we've got a couple of suggestions in there from an employee protagonist who wants to enhance his computer skills. Yeah, so maybe we've got an employee who really needs to learn a new software program because if they don't, their jobs, they could lose out on a job promotion to their arch nemesis who already seems to have some real proficiency with this software program. So it's really important that they learn it, well and fast. Learning computer skills on an open computer that crashes all the time. That's awesome, Brian. I love that. There's a whole class of stories of man versus nature stories, and I think that there should be a whole class of stories called man versus technology stories. I think that would be great, or human versus technology.
The tyranny of technology.
Exactly. Okay. All right. So, something so that there's somebody who wants to do it. Somebody you've got a problem, you've got a weakness, you've got a goal, you've got an antagonist, somebody who, maybe you're sort of battling against. Those are the kinds of things that can start to kind of create that sense of sort of tension within an environment. Oh, we've got a couple more computer skills. Protagonist wants to process orders for over 200 customers within 1 week. The antagonist is a competing team member who doesn't think the protagonist can do it. These are great. I'm trying to hard to think of an antagonist in this employee who will want enhance his computer skills story. Like I said, it could be a situation where if they can master this software program, they've got a leg up about getting that promotion over the person who, sits in the next desk that they're really competing with. Or if I took a course years ago that was on how to query databases, and the scenario in it was you're a temp, you're about to leave, everybody else is left for the day, you're just packing up, and the VP of sales, who's the person who gets to decide whether your temp position turns into a permanent job, calls down and says, I need these sales figures out of the database right now. And so you have to figure out how to get those sales figures out of the computer and get it to this VP of consulting. Otherwise, you might not get the job. So the opposing goal for the antagonist in the story. So
for the interviewing, the HR guy, he wants to just maybe the managers or the protagonist in the story is the managers, and they're trying to hire quality people, but they don't recognize that there are certain guidelines out there for the company. The HR people, they're the people who put together the guidelines, and so if they would just all kind of follow along and learn the guidelines, because that's the greater learning objectives of the course, then they'd be better. But there's a conflict between the HR people and the managers themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I think you're right. I think that there's a bunch of different ways to do that. There's the if you're talking about the HR people, maybe the manager that's your sort of antagonist doesn't want to change their ways because they believe that their intuitive sense of people is really the way to hire people, and so it's confirming them and their experience, and so things that are quote-unquote newfangled make them feel sort of insecure because it's an older manager and he's been doing it this way for 30 years, and if you try to change him, it's going to make him feel kind of old and out of date, and he doesn't want to feel that way. So, threatening people's identities and things that threaten people's identities can be very compelling motivations for stuff.
That goes by, J.P. Wang had a follow-up saying, hey, what about the motivation for the antagonist for the computer skill guy? And Wang, a thought that comes to my mind is the idea that if you're doing an upgrade, the idea you have is that they're trying to learn an old system. You probably wouldn't be doing a whole lot of training on an old system, but you would very commonly put together a training program to help people learn new systems. But your antagonist could be one of the more veteran members of the company or the team who don't like change or don't believe that it's going to be system agnostic, where meaning it could be both. The new system could function both on Macs or on PCs. So you could have somebody who just doesn't believe in the product itself.
Yeah, you could. Doesn't Saturday Night Live have like skits about the evil IT guys or the whatever? Like they could be fabulous antagonists in a computer skills piece. Years ago, I had a coworker who kind of had a little bit of he knew everything, and so on the technical side, and was a little bit too
pompous,
a little bit condescending. Let's just put it that way. And so it became a real goal for me to prove that I wasn't stupid about technology to him because he just annoyed me. So that kind of thing. These are all great. Thanks.
Yeah, good stuff, Julie.
So and as I mentioned, we sort of know how the structure is supposed to work. Act 1, we get the problem, we start to have some conflict. Act 2, that gets hard, it gets more challenging until finally we get some kind of climax. So being able to kind of think through that, like how can we have a series of incidents that happen that kind of gradually escalate the tension in the situation. And there's things like the hero's journey, which everybody knows kind of got used in Star Wars, and it has a bunch of steps. This is a little too complicated. I'll admit I'm not going to go through all of these because I don't have a lot of time today. But this is one of those things where There's a whole slew of things that can happen here, but let's not get too hung up in that. A simpler model is probably the 3-act structure, and you can find this on Wikipedia, and it gets talked about in a lot of different places. But the first act is typically establishes the characters, it establishes the normal world. And then there's an inciting incident, something that happens that signals the end of the first act usually and sort of ensures that life's never going to be the same. Something happens that sort of kicks into the trouble, creates this problem that starts to happen, changes the status quo, and this can happen fairly quickly. And it raises the sort of dramatic question that's going to be answered in the climax of the story. So if you start with that one, something happens. So for example, if we think about Eric's story, something might happen where, a food safety problem might crop up. And I'll show an example of that in a moment. Then the second act, rising action. Oh, sorry, by the way, while we're here, I should mention that I will give you guys a link to access these slides. These slides are out on SlideShare, so you will be able to get these later. But there's a rising action. The hero attempts to resolve the problem, but things just get worse. And one of the ways that you do a second act is you have the hero try to resolve a problem the way that they've always done it. And the way that they've always done it doesn't necessarily work. So if Eric's response to kind of problems around the kitchen is to just kind of do it himself real quick or whatever it is, as opposed to like spending the time to do it right, then we get to see how his current practices, and it might be your current practices around interviewing, your current practices around technology, fail because they just aren't up to the, you need to step it up in order to be able to really deal with the challenge. It gets worse because the hero doesn't have the needed skills yet. They're still doing things the old way. And they need to not only learn these skills, but arrive at a higher sense of awareness of who they are and what they're capable of, which in turn changes them. So character development. So not only are they learning, here's the things I need to do to manage a kitchen, but they're also learning kind of here's the different attitude I need to take if I'm the boss and I'm the leader and I'm in charge, as opposed to if I'm just the kind of hotshot chef over doing my thing over in the corner.
So Julie, that's really the point where, from an instructional design point, where we really connect learning objectives to the story.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that that's a really good point, because that's exactly the thing where when we're making the case for it, and I mean one of the things I think is the most interesting in most learning environments is the difference between kind of knowing knowledge and belief, or knowledge and action. So I can know the right thing to do, but I may still not be doing it. So for example, lots of people know that texting while driving is bad, but they still do it. You still have these behaviors. Or people may know that a new method for coaching employees is good, but you're just in these old habits and things like that. So what you're trying to do is really create a scenario where they're seeing and experiencing, not just being told, but seeing and experiencing the benefit and the reason for making a change, changing a behavior, changing a practice, doing something different, doing something new. So this is definitely a place where you can really kind of connect the dots on those things.
And put them in, I guess when you're developing a branching simulation, you put them in a position where that option, the common option that they would normally do, is clearly there for them, but it ends with a drastic decision, or not drastic decision, but a clear failure or less than desirable outcome.
Yeah, and one of the big things that we need to do is make that bad choice look appealing, because the reasons we know the right thing to do usually, and it just doesn't mean that we do it. Like, I know I should get my homework done before I watch TV, but if I'm a student or whatever it is, but that doesn't mean that I do that. So we want to kind of understand why that bad option is appealing and make it kind of look good. It might
involve we all go through that kind of rationalizing. I know I shouldn't do this. However, you know what? I'll make time. I'll have time later, or I won't take a bath, and instead I'll do my homework.
Right.
Not that I would do that, but
Yeah, and so something like having a choice between 3 things I should do versus 1 thing I should do and 2 things I shouldn't do. Like choosing between 3 things I should do, that kind of is a more interesting choice, because you've got a cost to not doing the other things. A lot of times when we write scenarios, we write multiple choice questions, Like, there's no consequence to not doing the other things because it's sort of obvious what the right thing to do is, and I know how to kind of please the e-learning gods and make the right choice. But if you can make it an interesting choice where I want to do this and I want to do this, now I have to pick between two of them and then find out what happens, then it becomes much more of a kind of challenge too.
It goes to putting gravity behind the choices. That's kind of what it comes down to, is you put them, make sure there's gravity behind them, and so that it's not just trivial distractors.
Right, exactly. So the third act is rising action for the primary challenge, the dark moment where the hero doubts him or herself and all appears lost, the climax, the final challenge, and a return or ending emotional justice is restored in the world. This is a simplification because I think some of the complexity that uses this for a novel length thing, we just flat out don't need in an instructional design scenario. But if you're interested in that, there's a lot of good books and things like that sort of talk about the more detailed version of this. So if we think about this, Act 1 is normal world, inciting incident. Act 2 is things get worse, need skills, need to develop character. Act 3 is a big challenge, dark moment, climax, follow-up. So if we follow this for our purposes of our character here, we also want his character to change through this. We want that character development or that character arc to happen. So if we think about this, Act 1, Eric's cocky, he's convinced everything, he's way ahead of everything. Joanne, his antagonist, warns him that there's a house inspection, but he kind of blows her off because he's sort of busy with his menu and things like that. And then the inspection happens and it does not go well. So you could tie a learning activity in there where you actually act as the learning activity and find all the things that Eric's doing wrong. People actually really like, I've gotten really good responses to that because people like being able to correct other people. It's one of our sort of normal human impulses. So putting your learner in the role of the health inspector at that point can help kind of make that story compelling and things like that. So Eric's basically, he screwed up. This is his inciting incident. He knows he needs to change something. He gets embarrassed, but he's a resilient guy, and his ego is pretty healthy, so he rallies pretty quickly. He addresses the specific health concerns in the inspection. He fixes those things, but he doesn't really get proactive about kind of changing and preventing. So in Act 2, we can have another surprise inspection to find new problems, and now the restaurant could be shut down. And as it happens, his restaurant critic that he's so concerned about the opinion of actually witnesses the whole debacle. So now we're at our big challenge. Eric's warned by the owner that he isn't cutting it and he may get fired. His dark moment, he may actually just admit, Joanne, you're probably right, I'm not cut out for this. I need to just go back to being just the chef. The follow-up from the health inspector, happens. Joanne helps them with preventative safety. They manage to keep the restaurant open. And after steady development, after a while, they actually get the new review and are added to the best restaurant list. So, all works out in as well at the end, but only after Eric learns that, I need to care about this stuff and I need to be proactive about it. I can't just be reactive in how I deal with kind of health and safety concerns and things like that. And if you've got good learning activities in there, either role plays or scenarios or things like that within those things, you can use this as the overarching framework for stuff. So that's an example of kind of how we could do that. So if we think about some of these, interviewing could go from, just trying to get it out to some of these managers. The managers start to kind of screw up big. And maybe one of the things our hero, our HR professional, finds out is that she can't just lecture people. She can't just tell them the right things to do. She has to understand what they care about and why they care about it if she wants them to change their behavior. And so she actually has to learn to change her approach in working with these managers so that she's understanding their goals better rather than just lecturing them about legal procedures and things like that. And so she has to figure out why her audience is going to care about good interviewing techniques and staying legal and all of those kinds of things. And there could be threatened lawsuits and big disasters and stuff like that that kind of create the three-act structure in that. In sales, I think Lance, you had the idea of kind of dealing with the old school guy. the old school person, female, male, whatever, who is resistant to sort of changing the way that they're doing things. And you could do some really nice, kind of nice progression within sales scenarios for that. I'm still trying to think about how the computer skill man versus technology story would go, and how you kind of escalate that one. There's probably some file that's threatening to be lost or something like that.
We had a scenario that we developed. In fact, I think they presented on it at last year's ILU conference, the idea of don't blow up the server room. And you were an IT guy, and you were learning the tips and tricks. And there was a more senior IT guy who kind of stepped in and played the mentor and coached you along, but let you get along far enough to cause some trouble. And there were executives who were up above who kind of played the antagonist as well, and they were putting pressure on you to manage your trouble tickets and get things done in a timely manner, but you didn't have enough skills to handle certain things, and you had to maybe you were escalating things to a different echelon of maintenance than would be required of someone more senior and experienced. So there's all sorts of options like that. Yeah, back to the sales one. The idea if you have if your company's been merged or been acquired by another company, and now you're given a different set of standards or a different model to follow, and so just the system or the organization itself can act as an antagonist, where you're forced to no longer do things the old way, but have to adopt the new.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that has some really nice possibilities attached to it.
Great stuff.
A couple of other sort of specific tips around this. One of the big ones is tell, don't show. Show, don't tell. Excuse me, I said that wrong. Show, don't tell. You can tell people the right thing to do, but if you let them connect the dots themselves, that's much more powerful and durable in terms of actual behavior. The example I always use is if you saw the movie Eat, Pray, Love, there's a scene where Julia Roberts is saying, I'm at rock bottom, or something like that, except she's walking along a street in Manhattan with her friends, looking all gorgeous and Julia Roberts-y and saying it, and kind of, not that kind of critical turn, she's just like, I'm at rock bottom. And you're just like, yeah, sure you are. You're Julia Roberts. You're all gorgeous, and fabulous, and I'm not totally convinced. Sorry, are you guys seeing my screen? Okay, you are seeing my screen. The wonderful world of Apple updating software was just trying to make my life difficult.
There is a little lag, but you're caught up now.
Okay, great, thanks. If you read the book, the way that she describes this is at 3 a.m. I was hiding in my bathroom for something like the 47th consecutive night, and as during all those nights before, I was sobbing so hard that a lake of tears and snot was spreading before me on the bathroom tiles. I'm like, okay, that feels different, right? One is actually more visual because it's a movie, and the other is text. But if you want to talk about what's being really conveyed and what you're understanding about somebody, like the show is way more powerful than the tell. And so I sometimes talk about, I think I've got another slide on this, about consequence-based feedback. But being able to see actions is character, and this is a line from Jenny Cruzy, and I mentioned the podcast Popcorn Dialogues, which is really very fun, where they talk about how do you establish good action. Saying somebody's a bad person isn't nearly as interesting as seeing them being a bad person. And what you say about them isn't nearly as compelling as what they do. So somebody can say, I love puppies, but then if they kick a puppy, you know which one wins. This is Jenny Cruzy's example. That what they're saying isn't true, but what they're doing is really the heart of their character. So those kinds of things. I saw a blog post recently where they were talking about you weren't allowed to say what anybody was thinking. You had to show what they were thinking through their actions, and he's like, this will make you a better writer. And I think I totally understand letting people kind of come to their own conclusions about stuff. All right, we're done at 2, right, Lance?
Yeah, so we got about 7 minutes left.
Okay, great. So dialogue, so this is just a quick thing. An angry customer comes into a store unhappy about her phone versus a middle-aged woman storms into the store. I cannot believe the shoddiness of this product. When I purchased this, pay this much for a device, I expect it to last longer than 3 days. So if you think about it, the description of what's happening versus actually being able to see people and hear people talk to you makes it, again, feel more vivid and more real. Consequence-based feedback. So a lot of times in e-learning environments, you see feedback like, incorrect, a better choice would be to establish a perimeter before proceeding into the secure area, which is really different than blam, You just triggered a secondary device, killing yourself and several bystanders, right? One is coaching, the other is consequence.
Absolutely.
And I have a theory that, oops, I don't have it on the screen. I have a theory that the first one feels like an opinion to people. You know, I can choose to buy into this opinion or not buy into this opinion, whereas the second feels more like data. It's more like data and experience. And I think that people use data and experience more when they're actually then subsequently making decisions. So I think it has an actual, like, whether you show consequences versus just tell people that was a bad choice versus seeing what happens when you make a bad choice, that those have some real translations into behavior.
I think back with the whole consequences in the terms of what's the term? I don't know, failing forward, where you've got the idea that you're going to remember. A lot of people go through these courses with the intent of doing it wrong to see what happens, and if you don't put enough validity and truth to the bad choices, you're missing an opportunity to really educate.
Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely. So a couple of other quick things. This is from Clark, who's going to be doing your keynotes at the next session. He's always great. He talks about, kind of exaggerating the circumstances a little bit to make it feel more compelling. Because these aren't really happening to people, you kind of sometimes need to dial it up. So he talks about you're not working on a patient, you're working to save the ambassador's daughter, or you're not just making a deal, you're making the deal that the business is going to need to keep the company from going into receivership. Or you're not just designing a networking solution, you're designing one to support the communications for the rebels overthrowing the oppressive regime. So he's using examples of how do you kind of ramp up the tension a little bit so that it feels more compelling. Now the thing you want to really be careful about is avoiding cliches too much, and that's because that sort of tunes people back out. But if you can figure out ways of dialing up the tension without kind of going to cliche place. This is links on the page, but it's the YouTube video trailer for every Oscar movie ever. It's slightly offensive, but it's kind of funny. I skip over it because we're running out of time. But there's actually some interesting research that looks at if humor is used and things like that, that can be more memorable. And so there's actual research on it that humorous things. The problem is humor is very subjective. So some people think that the cat in the frog costume is hilarious, and other people are like, I'm not a big cat person. So, you want to test, particularly if you're trying to use humor, you want to test it with your audience and see if it resonates.
That goes back to the whole kicking the puppy thing, because I love cats. They're delicious.
Right.
No, I'm just kidding.
There's lots of, I said you want to avoid cliches, but there's actually a lot of tropes. There's a great website called tvtropes.org that lists all sorts of tropes that TV shows use, and you can actually, if you want some inspiration, you can just go browse around on that site and find some tropes that you might be able to bring in as kind of creative, kickstarters in your stories. It is a time suck. You can spend hours on that site, so just you've been warned. A lot of the nonfiction shows have storylines to them too. So House Hunters, it's about having 3 choices. There's pros and cons to each choice. Which one's going to be the compelling one? Which one can we eliminate first? Like, there's a story to that, and you could use that same story, those sort of story structures from TV shows and things like that, to kind of figure out ways to make it interesting. So which approach should I take? Well, I can examine these 3 approaches. I can eliminate one, and I can choose between 2. Like that kind of thing. That can be another way to take content and make it interesting. We are almost out of time. So Resonate is a great book on nonfiction storytelling. She talks about how to make visual stories that transform audiences. She's talking about it for talking. She talks about how a lot of the great speeches, their model is current state, future state. That's the story they're telling. Let me tell you what's happening now. Let me tell you where we can be. Let me tell you what's happening now. Let me tell you where we can be. She looks at Steve Jobs and Martin Luther King and those kinds of things. And she has this little sort of sparkline flow, which this is a bad representation of it. But if you look in the book, they use a sparkline to kind of map the way the story goes through this.
Well, Julie, thank you so much. I'm sorry, go ahead if you were going to wrap up.
Oh, the last one, this is another link, and the best story of all is the story of the learner story. So how can you make them awesome, or how can you make them the hero of their own story? And I won't get into a ton of details on it, but it's always a good kind of closeout because other stories are never as compelling as their own story. So helping them bring their stories into training or share their own stories or share their own problems or challenges and then help solve those is honestly way better than any story that you're going to make up. So figuring out ways to do that is really great. And there's a lovely thing from Kathy Sierra that I'll link to in the resource page, which you can get to here. The slides and references, the bit.ly/_ls, or sorry, bit.ly/ls_story. You find a link to several of the references that I put in here, and also a link to the SlideShare slides.
Awesome. Julie, thank you so much. We appreciate it. I mean, one of the questions or comments that came up from Rebecca, hey, best webinar I've attended in a while. Thanks for making the session interactive despite the technology limitations, and thanks for taking time on your own slides, given that you're talking about it to us, the NID. So I'm surprised at how many people people don't actually talk about their own slides. So thank you, Julie. We really appreciate it. You're always a great NextLearn friend, and we look forward to working with you in the future. So.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm so glad it was useful for people.
Yeah, and to all of you who attended, I really appreciate it, and we look forward. I think next month we have Chad Checketts from Humentum, and he's going to be presenting, and I don't have the topic in front of me. Good job, Lance. All right, but please check out the Immersive Learning University website. We've got our the schedule posted there. Chad's topic is posted there as well, and we look forward to seeing you guys next month. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.